Nobody threw a parade for Generation X. No think pieces about their resilience. No viral TikTok celebrating their work ethic. No corporations rebranding themselves to win their loyalty. They were born between roughly 1965 and 1980, sandwiched between the loudest generation in history and the most analyzed one, and somehow, for decades, they just got skipped. And the strange thing is, they don't seem to mind. That's not indifference. That's not bitterness. That's something much more psychologically interesting. That's a generation that was so thoroughly raised without external validation that they genuinely stopped needing it. And today, we're going to look at what that actually does to a person. Because the Gen X story isn't really about being overlooked. It's about what happens to human psychology when nobody's watching, when nobody's clapping, and when you figure out very early that you're mostly on your own. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning tells you everything. Picture a Tuesday afternoon in 1979. You're 9 years old. The school bell rings, and while other kids are being picked up at the gate, you're walking home alone, key around your neck, letting yourself into a quiet house. No parent in the kitchen, no one asking how your day was. You make yourself a sandwich, sit down in front of the TV, and wait. This wasn't neglect in most cases. This was just life. Both parents working wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was economic reality. By the mid-1980s, roughly 7 million American children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school, an entire generation coming home to empty houses. Researchers started calling them latchkey kids, named for the house key they wore around their necks like a quiet little symbol of early independence. What does that experience actually do to a developing brain? Quite a lot, it turns out. When a child is consistently left to manage their own time, emotions, and problems without adult mediation, the brain adapts. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning, impulse control, and consequence evaluation, gets an early and intensive workout. You learn to read environments quickly. You learn to self-regulate because there's no one else to regulate you. You learn, very fundamentally, that waiting for rescue is a losing strategy. Psychologists describe this kind of upbringing as producing what's called an internal locus of control, the deep-seated belief that outcomes in your life are primarily determined by your own actions, not by luck, authority figures, or external circumstances. Gen X didn't develop this as a philosophy. They developed it as a survival skill. And once it's wired in that early, it doesn't go away. But here's where it gets more complicated. Independence was only one half of the lesson. The other half was about trust. Gen X watched their parents' generation make a very specific deal with the world. Work hard, stay loyal, follow the rules, and in return, you'll get stability, security, a pension, a life that makes sense. That was the contract. And then, right in front of them, that contract got shredded. Divorce rates climbed through the 1970s and 80s at unprecedented levels. Corporations that had employed people for decades started handing out mass layoffs as a quarterly strategy. Watergate told them that the most powerful man in the country would lie directly to their faces. The AIDS crisis showed them that institutions could be catastrophically slow to act when the people dying weren't considered important enough. Iran-Contra, savings and loan scandals. The evening news was essentially a recurring lesson in the gap between what adults promised and what adults delivered. Psychologists have a term for the mental adjustment that follows repeated exposure to this kind of disappointment. It's called defensive pessimism. Not hopelessness, that's different. Defensive pessimism is a cognitive strategy where you lower your expectations in advance, not because you don't care, but because you've learned that caring too openly, hoping too visibly, leaves you exposed in ways that hurt. You hope quietly, you plan for the worst, and when things actually go well, you're relieved rather than surprised. This is often mistaken for cynicism from the outside. It isn't. Cynicism is contempt. Defensive pessimism is armor. And Gen X built that armor early out of necessity, and they've been wearing it so long they barely notice it anymore. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention. What it meant to be bored as a Gen X kid. Real boredom. Not the kind where you switch apps. The kind where there is genuinely nothing to do and no device to fill the silence, and you have to sit with your own brain for hours at a time. Saturday afternoon. No plans, no screens worth mentioning, maybe a few television channels that aren't showing anything you want to watch. And so you go outside. Or you read something. Or you build something out of whatever's in the garage. Or you and your friends create an entire world out of nothing, just to fill the afternoon. Cognitive researchers have become increasingly interested in what unstructured time actually does to developing minds. The evidence suggests that boredom isn't a problem to be solved. It's a condition that produces something valuable. When the brain isn't being fed external stimulation, it activates what neuroscientists call the default mode network. This is the neural system associated with imagination, self-reflection, long-term planning, and creative thinking. The ability to generate your own interior life rather than consuming someone else's. Gen X had enormous amounts of this, not by design, just by circumstance. And it produced something you can still observe in them today. A certain comfort with silence, an ability to work through problems internally before externalizing them. A resistance to the constant noise that younger generations sometimes seem unable to function without. They also learned patience in a way that feels almost foreign now. You waited a week for the next episode. You rewound the tape. You rode your bike to the library and hoped the book you needed wasn't already checked out. Information had friction, and friction, it turns out, creates value. Cognitive psychologists call this the generation effect. Information we have to work to obtain becomes more deeply encoded in memory than information that simply appears on demand. Gen X had to earn what they knew. And that changes your relationship with knowledge. Here's the paradox at the center of Gen X psychology, and it's a genuine one. They are simultaneously the most self-reliant generation alive and some of the most quietly loyal people you will ever meet. They will not ask for help. That's almost a point of pride. They will figure it out themselves, stay late by themselves, solve the problem by themselves, because asking feels like admitting something they're not comfortable admitting. Research published in the Journal of Adult Development found that Gen Xers consistently report lower levels of seeking social support during stressful periods, not because they lack the relationships, but because the act of asking cuts against something deeply ingrained. And yet, if you need help, they show up. No announcement, no social media post about what a great friend they are. They just appear. They fix the thing, help you move, sit with you in the hard moment, and then go home without needing to discuss it. This comes directly from how those friendships were formed in the first place. When your parents are working and the neighborhood is your primary social world, your friends become something more than friends. They become your functional family for large stretches of time. You figure things out together. You cover for each other. You develop a loyalty that was forged in actual shared experience rather than in curated social performance. That kind of bond doesn't need to be broadcast. It doesn't need validation. It just exists. Let's talk about Gen X and authority, because this one is frequently misread. Gen X is not anti-authority. That's too simple. What they are is anti-incompetence wearing authority's clothes. If you have genuinely earned your position, if you know what you're doing, if you can back up your title with actual skill, Gen X will work harder for you than almost anyone. They respect competence the way other generations might respect rank. Show them you know what you're doing and you'll have their loyalty. Show them you don't, and no title in the world will compensate for that. This is a direct product of what they witnessed growing up. They watched credentialed, authoritative adults make catastrophically bad decisions with enormous confidence. They internalized early that the person at the front of the room isn't automatically right, that the person in the suit doesn't automatically know more than you, and that following someone off a cliff because they have an impressive title is a choice you make, not an obligation you were born with. It's worth noting that this same skepticism applies to praise. Gen X grew up in a pre-participation trophy world. If you did something well, sometimes an adult nodded. Sometimes nothing was said at all. You just knew internally whether you'd done a good job or not. This created a self-evaluation system that doesn't require external input to function. They don't need to be told they did well. They know. And by the same logic, they don't need to be told they failed. They know that too. The psychological term for this is internal validation. And while it sounds like a straightforwardly good thing, it comes with a shadow. People who were raised without consistent positive feedback can sometimes struggle to receive it as adults. A genuine compliment can feel suspicious. Recognition can feel like a setup, because in their formative experience, warmth and attention weren't constants. They were intermittent signals you learned not to depend on. Now, layer on top of all of this the economic reality. The youngest Gen Xers graduated into the wreckage of the dot-com bust. The oldest were hitting their peak earning years when the 2008 financial crisis landed. In between, they watched the slow erosion of job security, pension plans, and the idea that loyalty to a company would be repaid in kind. Research on financial trauma during formative career years suggests that these experiences leave lasting marks. Not just on savings behavior, though Gen X does tend toward financial caution, but on the fundamental sense of security that underlies every other decision in adult life. It affects how you take risks, how you plan for the future, how much you let yourself relax into any given moment of stability. The response for many Gen Xers wasn't despair, it was diversification, multiple income streams, side skills, the quiet practical logic of never putting everything in one basket because they've watched that basket get dropped too many times. And here's what's interesting, that same logic applies to their emotional lives. They diversified there too. They don't put all their emotional investment into one source of validation, one relationship, one institution. They hold things a little loosely, not because they don't care, but because they've learned, empirically, that things change, that what feels permanent usually isn't, and that the most dangerous thing you can do is build your entire psychological infrastructure around something you can't control. What does all of this produce, taken together? It produces a type of person who is genuinely hard to rattle, not because nothing affects them, but because they've spent their entire lives building an internal world that doesn't depend on external circumstances staying stable. When the crisis hits, they don't freeze. They go quiet, assess, and start solving. Because crisis was in many ways just Tuesday when they were growing up. They are the coworker who shows up the day after their world falls apart and doesn't say a word about it. They are the friend who fixes your problem before you finished explaining it. They are the parent who gives their children everything they didn't have, the attention, the presence, the warmth, and then quietly worries they've made them too soft for the world that's actually out there. They carry something most people are still trying to learn, how to need very little from the outside world, how to find satisfaction in the work itself, not the applause that follows it, how to hold stability inside yourself when everything around you is uncertain. That wasn't therapy. That wasn't a seminar. That was just childhood in a specific decade, with a specific set of absences, producing a specific kind of person. There's a reason Gen X doesn't trend online much, doesn't write many manifestos, doesn't show up loudly in the cultural conversation demanding recognition. It's not because they have nothing to say. It's because they were raised in a world that didn't ask them how they felt. And somewhere along the way, they stopped expecting it to. They built something instead. Quietly. Without announcing it. The way you do when you've learned that the work matters more than the credit, and that the most reliable applause is the kind that comes from inside. That, more than anything, might be the most psychologically honest thing about them. They don't need the parade. They never did. If this resonated with you, subscribe to the Human Thinking Lab for more deep dives into the psychology of how we're shaped by the worlds we grew up in. And if you want to support this kind of content, consider becoming a channel member. I'll see you in the next one.